Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to RBCM at Outside, a Movable Feast. And we are not here today to talk about Paris in the 1920s. We're talking about a different kind of movable feast. And my name is Liz Crocker, and I'm a learning program developer at the Royal BC Museum. And I am here today at beautiful Sitchalnuth. Sitchalnuth is the Lekwungen name for this place because we are on the territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, and the ancestors of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nation used to live along this beach. I'm gonna actually flip the camera around. Whoa, there's our intrepid biologist. You can see, so there used to be longhouses all the way down this beach. It's a very important village site. It is today known by the English name Willow's Beach as well, but it's so great to know the Lekwungen name is Sitchalnuth. So welcome, everybody. I'll flip it back around to myself for a second. So we're going to be together for about 30 minutes. This is webinar format. If you've never joined us before, we're live outside. Anything could happen. We've got a little window without rain, but it's threatening to come back again. So we're going to do our best. There might be umbrellas in the camera, but it's webinar format. So you can type in your questions or comments in the chat. And those of you joining us on Facebook, same thing. And my colleague Jenny's in the room, and she will get comments and questions to us. And just to let you know, I'm going to do another one of these programs in November, on November 18th. And that one is going to be about restoration. We're going to be at a local park near the museum, and it's an urban park, and look at how that is being restored and the kind of the native species that are coming back to that place. But for today's program, a Movable Feast, we're going to be learning about wrack, beach wrack. And I've got two of our curators from the Royal BC Museum here with me today, Dr. Joel Gibson, curator of entomology. They're looking at me now, Joel. Hang on, I should flip around while I'm into. Wave, Joel. There's Joel. And Dr. Henry Choong, who is a curator of invertebrate zoology. So those animals without backbones, and entomology is a study of insects. So I've got an insect guy and an invertebrate guy here on the beach. It's going to be very interesting. What are we going to find? I'm excited. Okay, so what I'm going to do is try to keep the camera dry. And I don't know, I'll turn it over to you two, and you can maybe give a little introduction about what we're looking for and why it's important. And we can see if we can have a close-up look at some of them. All right. Henry.
Okay. Hi, good morning. So today we will be talking about wrack on the beach, in particular seaweed wrack. And you know, we'll talk about why wrack is actually an important component to biodiversity, and why it's important to us here. Now, in this area, so if you want to pan around, so we're very close to houses, and essentially, you know, we're in an urban environment, which sometimes, and we're lucky because we have, you know, we're really close to the beach. We're really close to biodiversity here, but it's very easy to lose track of how important biodiversity is sometimes when it's so close to us. So we'll talk about wrack on the beach today, but let's start from where the wrack comes from. And what you see here, you see a bunch of wrack from green algae, brown algae, and you also see seagrass.
Okay,
and,
I have a question.
Yep.
Okay, so wrack,
Yep.
is this, it kind of looks messy here. All this sort of green seaweed that I'm looking at, I think it's maybe seaweed or some kind of aquatic plant. This is what you are referring to as wrack.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct. It looks messy because it is, because it's been carried from the near shore here onto the beach, and this tells us a couple of things. Different wrack grows on different surfaces, and eelgrass, for example, like to grow offshore in on a muddy surface. Some kelp, for example, like to attach themselves to rocks as to this little algae here, which is called ulva, right? So different algae will attach to different surfaces. Now, the important thing to us here this morning is that when you have kelp and algae and grasses growing offshore, they're not growing, they're not living independently of other marine animals, right? So, for example, on a, let me just show you. This, for example, okay, this is the holdfast of bull kelp. Okay, the holdfast allows the kelp to attach itself to the surface.
Of a rock or whatever.
Most likely a rock in this case. Okay, and there you see, and there's the float on top.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
when the kelp is growing, for example, it also provides in itself surfaces for other marine animals to live on. Okay, a lot of marine invertebrates live on other invertebrates or other surfaces. So, and then other invertebrates in turn live on them. So in this case, if I turn this holdfast around, you can
Are you
see,
saying there's animals on here?
yes,
Henry?
yes, I do. So you see these little fuzzy bits here, which are really difficult to see on camera. In fact, they're really difficult to see unless you have a microscope. But what these little fuzzy things here are marine animals called hydroids. And hydroids are related to corals and jellyfish, the little gelatinous animals. And they have a life stage in which they live on surfaces. They have a polyp stage in which they kind of grow like plants. And so you see what essentially is happening here is you have an animal forest, okay? And so what happens when that animal, parts of that animal forest gets transferred, animal and plant matter, like your seagrasses here, what this does is, so you have an environment in which other invertebrates live, and then there are there are vertebrates that depend on them that also live in that environment, right? So, and then what happens is you get part of that animal forest being transported to the shore in the form of wrack, which you see here. And so, as Liz said earlier, yeah, it looks like a mess, but what's really being transferred here is a significant amount of food and shelter, okay, for other animals, which then live on the shore. And that is, and how they interact and what we find, and that's what Joel will talk to you about.
I was going to say, this must be why we have the insect guy with us. Let me guess.
Hello, everyone.
Insects?
How are you doing? Yeah, insects are cool because the way I was taught back in school is this is a hard line. This is a hard line of salt. As in below there, it's salt water and they can't live. And above here, something on my face.
A little bit. Oh, there it goes.
Oh, my lunch.
It's rack. You got, or is it rack?
Yes.
Rack in your beard.
I wouldn't want to eat this rat. Thank you. But it was always a hard line. Like salt water, insects can't live in salt water. That's the way it is. But as Henry set up, it's kind of an interesting case here at the beach where you've got things that are really close to salt water and can be a really good source of shelter and food and everything Henry was talking about. So this is where the Movable Feast comes in, because it's even interesting at this time of day. You can see it's all getting washed in, and then it'll sit here for a couple of hours until low tide, and then it'll come back in. So these lines are always moving. But what these lines are is just big piles of food. Now, that's not very pleasant food, but there's a lot of insects. And what Henry and I and other people around the world are starting to find is there's things that have gotten really specialized on exactly this type of food. And that's one thing insects are really good at. If there's a special type of food, there is an insect that will find it. whether that's, you know, the blood of people and their mosquitoes, or if it's inside of other plants and there's something, or it's inside of your cherries and it's destroying your cherry crop and you're not so happy about that. But this is a type of food that some insects have found. And it's interesting because it's right next to this line. So when it's growing out there, when you've got all of this algae or eelgrass out in the water, not available, not accessible, doors closed. As soon as it washes up here, it's totally available. And then you go 20 yards that way and there's none up there. So you end up with this really weird habitat that's only about 1.5 meters wide, but it goes around the entire world. So someplace like BC, which has all of this coastline, has this, you know, 2 meters of habitat that wraps around the whole province, which is a really neat thing because what we're starting to find is it tends to be at 2 meters that not a lot of people have looked at.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. So this is like an intertidal zone.
Exactly.
That's so
exactly
people that study insects didn't used to look at these areas.
Well, I think they did. I mean, I don't want to take anything away from all these great entomologists of the past, but for a lot of things, these tended to be the groups because there's not a lot of species, and they always kind of tend to be the weirdo species. So if you go that way and there's Gary Oak forests, and there's all these great stories about things that are in Gary Oak forests and are adapted to them or are on the camas lilies. And it was a great thing to study and people did a lot of work. And they're like, yeah, there's one weirdo species that's on the beach, but we won't worry about that. And what I'm starting to find is that if you gather up all these weirdo groups, there's always the one that ends up that's on the beach. And what we're starting to find is they're only on the beach. You don't find them anywhere else. And it's probably because all they eat is wrack.
Right. Okay, not to go off on a tangent, but I know a couple of years ago you were in the Great Bear Rainforest, so on the central coast of BC. So did you look at insects on the beach there? Were they different species there than we'd find down here on the south coast of?
Probably.
Okay.
Because the funny thing, I love that you brought that up, is because one of the interesting things is the further you go north in BC, you get closer to things like Alaska, which is closer to Russia, which is really this continual line all the way around to Japan. So the question is, whereas if we go south from here, like this is good, but if you go around the corner in Puget Sound, then you're going down the coast and you're in California.
Sure. Yeah.
So the question, Henry and I always have this debate, is BC more California or is it more Alaska and Russia? And it depends. And that line kind of changes for every different group.
We're right in the middle.
Right in the
sort
middle.
of right in the middle, sort of.
It's exactly the
yeah.
same as Japan. And there's some reason to think there's species that go from Japan and wrap all the way around to here, but then not any farther south.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Okay, so I bet you we're gonna try to look. Are we gonna look closer and see if we can identify anything? And while we're maybe doing that, not to put you on the spot, Jenny, I saw, was there a question in the Q&A? Could you?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions that I think I can wrap into one question, and I'll just read them all out. So one was, where is the seaweed in kelp? Like, where does it grow and how? And the other question was, how far offshore does these plant materials come from? Example, how far does it travel?
Oh, good question. So the first question, Henry, was where does this plant material grow? Like, for example, bull kelp.
Yep.
How far out? Where is it growing? Where is it? How far out is it coming from?
Okay, so the environment that, like when you come to a beach, right? So the environment that is offshore is in part determined by what kind of a beach it is. So in this case, so here we have a sandy beach, and you look over there, you have a lot of rocks. Okay, and so now the rock extends obviously under the water here and goes off there, and you have between that a sandy shelf. So what you find growing is, for example, you have here green algae called ulva, and you have your seagrasses here. And the seagrasses like to grow on the sandy bottoms. Okay. It's not surf grass.
So it
grass.
partly depends on the species and partly on the
correct.
habitat, like the environment.
That is correct.
Okay.
Okay. And then further out you get
because bull kelp grows way out, like that's what sea otters love to attach themselves
and they
to.
attach to rocks,
right?
On the bottom, and they grow a little further out.
Big old bull kelp.
Okay.
Look at that, so gorgeous.
And for example, here, this is ulva. Excuse me. This is fucus, and fucus likes to grow on rocks as well. And you'll see these over on the fringes of the rocks over there, for example. Okay, so they're getting brought in as well. And now a very good illustration of where we are as kind of an intersection between marine and terrestrial systems. You'll also see in this rack terrestrial material. So, in other words, material.
Can you
from,
put it back there? Hang on. So what do you got there? Oh, you got it like from a cedar bough there.
Yeah. So
look at that.
So
Okay.
you get
Right.
you get your terrestrial
From a tree.
grasses and it comes here as well.
Okay.
Now, coming back to the marine material. So, I talked about animals growing on invertebrates growing on the algae and so on, an animal forest and all that. And the other thing I wanted to bring up also, or to mention also, is that then this rack, when we talk about eating on the rack, okay, they're consuming the rack itself, the insects on the shore are. And what else is also important in this equation is that the algae out there, the animal forests, are also kind of a delivery system for fats and other nutrients that would not normally be found on algae, right? Because there are animals that grow on them that contain these fats and nutrients.
And they're sorry to interrupt. They're washed up in the rack. Those animals,
because they're living on the rack, they'll be washed up with the rack as well. So that is being delivered as well. Now, and marine biologists have been studying these kinds of energy systems offshore. So it's also interesting for us to start to consider and ask questions about, okay, well, how does that work when that is transported into this realm, right? So how does that work? And that's where, people like Joel come in,
right?
Because they're looking at animals, insects, for example, which are, we have a category of insects which we define as marine insects, but commonly when people think of insects, they don't think of the marine system. Right. And that's where Joel comes in.
Right. So that kind of brings up the whole idea and concept of food webs, which I wanted you guys to talk about a bit, because that's why we called it a movable feast. So that food sources are coming from the marine, the ocean, and they're coming, here they are on this intertidal zone along the beach behind you. And now this food source has moved to this intertidal zone. And then who's eating it? Before you get into your insects, what are some other animals that eat? Like, what did you call it? Eating the rack? I've never used that term myself. Eating the rack. It's an excellent biology nerd term. Who's eating the rack, Joel?
I don't know that there's a lot. Like, I don't think there's birds that are going to specialize on the rack. They're here and they're in it. But, in terms of a large amount, it's not like you ever see some big grazers coming along. It's not like there's
shorebirds, probably.
Shorebirds will. But more often than not, it's the types of things Henry and I are talking about. They're here eating the things growing on the rack.
Okay.
And this is what we started to see is like this great thing about this weird little food web is that it is this crossing over between maybe birds that are normally shorebirds and they might be in there. What I've also found is there's a lot of wasps, all the wasps that are annoying on your patio.
Oh.
There's some of them we've started to see at beaches that kind of specialize on the rack, and they'll sit here and eat all of the insects living in the rack.
Oh.
So they've kind of tuned in, and you're like, well, so is that wasp now a shoreline wasp? Is it a marine reliant wasp? Who knows? It doesn't care. It's just hungry.
Or is it like us? It just likes different environments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the cool thing we're starting to see is that you've got stuff that's going back and forth, and this food web kind of overlaps what used to be considered two totally separate worlds that don't overlap, but they do. And there's a lot of things that only exist in the ocean.
And I know in forest ecosystems on land, those edges of habitats are so ripe with diversity. So this is
the same reason.
Okay.
It's open stuff and closed stuff. And
like
here's a line where
estuary.
they both can be.
Like
estuaries are right there. There's fresh water.
Right.
Flowing into this. So this is now like 3 different types of edges. It's terrestrial and freshwater and saltwater and land. So there's going to be stuff that only exists there.
Right.
It's only in freshwater near salt water, but slightly outside of the forest. That's a habitat.
And even though we're so, as Henry pointed out, so close to human habitation, there's still lots of biodiversity here.
Yes.
So do you either one of you see anything you recognize? I mean, Henry pointed out some of the plant species. I mean,
Yes.
on a day like this, are we going to see any insects, Joel?
Well, there's going to be some, but usually it's a case of the sunnier it gets, the more
Yeah.
chance you have. Not only is it, I always like to point this out when I'm out on like field walks with kids and stuff, is it's sunnier because the insects like to fly around. Well, no, it's easier to see them because it's sunny.
Well,
When
and
there's
I
more light, I can see them. My eyes ain't perfect.
that's right. And I want to show you, Joel does have his net. He's
Just in
ready
case.
just in case something flies up, and we can see here.
And
What-
there are some things that dig into the sand, but
Okay.
that's a whole other process. You can see what Henry's doing. And there's some people that are very intently looking for certain things.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes it's even called like mesofauna, where it's in between. It's small.
Okay.
Yeah,
And to do that, you have to dig up sand and filter it out. Or maybe you'll have to filter it and then add water
That's
and see
right.
things float out.
that's
Okay.
right. That's right. You know, sometimes there are things that are beach hoppers, for example, that are living down here that you'll see jump around when we dig into the sand, but of course not while we want to see them. But
course
the
not.
other thing which you don't see, you know, is between the grains of sand, for example, there's a whole other level of life there. There are species that only live, for example, between grains of sand. Now,
Wow.
They're tiny.
they're very, very small, and so those you know you can't see when I hold it, but I can assure you that when I'm holding something like
There's-
this up,
There's life in there.
there's life in here.
There's life in
Okay.
there. And Jenny, I saw a comment go across, but I missed it.
Yes, there's a couple. You kind of touched on about the ecosystems of the question was, do the land animals consume the plants on site and then digest them later, or take materials back to their lair for later consumption? You kind of talked about that, how it's not a lot of land animals, but there is this kind of in between.
Although it's a good question, because this summer, Henry, for the first time I actually saw this. I'm sure it happens all the time, but I'd never seen it before. Was this wasp nest that was in a washed up log on the beach. And we kind of sat there for a while, and all of the wasps there, because if you find a wasp nest, those are usually only this year's generation. They're all daughters, they're all sisters from this year.
Okay.
And they probably are like, nope, this is where their nest is. And they never left the beach. You kind of watch them and they would fly up and down the beach and pick off what they could find. And so it was a case where, yes, they were going back to their hive, but their hive was entirely on the beach. So
Yeah.
it's a weird case. And if it's a tiny island, well, everywhere's a beach. So
Right.
they never leave the beach. But it's a great question if they're taking stuff in. I know that's a big question with like salmon runs and how much of the dead salmon get pulled into the forest by bears, by birds, by wolves, by foxes. And they've started to find there's a huge amount of nutrients that make their way into the forest
Right.
from animals that either
Yeah.
pull them in or eat them and then deposit the remains from themselves in the forest later.
And then trees, it's found in the DNA of trees that
Yep,
are
and you
using that
when
soil.
you track it, they'll usually track it with like individual isotopes like nitrogen, and they'll say, oh, this is ocean nitrogen that ended up kilometers inland.
So cool.
Yeah.
It's all connected. It's all connected.
Yeah, it is.
And we also
Yeah.
have, oh, no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Henry.
I was going to say that, you know, one of the ways that you can observe physical remains of this ocean material in terrestrial animals is by looking at their poop.
Yep.
Okay, the remains of what they eat are in their poop. So that's one way people have been studying, for example, bear poop, raccoons, and so on, to see what proportion of their food is coming from the shoreline.
Yep. There's a career path for you. Then you get to use terms like scat.
That's right.
Ooh.
You do.
It's good. It's
You
good.
do. Now, you
It's
know,
fascinating.
one more thing I would like to mention, you know, in terms of bridging terrestrial and marine systems and ecosystems and so on, is, you know, coming back again to the beginning where we talk about wrack being messy, and look down here at all this wrack, okay? If you want a nice clean beach, it's very tempting to say, well, let's clean all this up. But what are you doing when you're cleaning this up? You're literally removing a huge amount of food and animals from this system. So, you know, the best to do is to leave it alone.
So don't clean up the rack.
That's right.
Let's not clean up this. Clean up the garbage, but not the rack.
That's right. That's right. Because as Joel has a very good way of putting it, you know, what do you want? A parking lot or a supermarket?
Love it. We want a natural supermarket. Okay, go ahead, Jenny. You got a question there.
There's kind of a question about that is I see people cultivating seaweed off of beaches. Is that legal?
It's usually, once again, it's a matter of volume. You know, I got an apple tree in my front yard. Somebody walking by eating an apple, I think that's great. I got to share apples with them. Somebody comes by and takes all the apples off my front tree. Yeah, I'm not so happy about that. So it's a matter of volume, and I can't tell you whether it's legal or not. I'm sure if you took all of it off of the beach, you're definitely causing a problem. But somebody coming and taking a small bucket of wrack and bringing it and chucking it in their garden, I don't think that's going to break any laws. And also doesn't really necessarily apply to this. Although once again, 1,000 people taking one bucket at a time will clear out the whole beach.
Right. And yeah, we should reiterate that we are not the legal experts on this. So you'd have to look at probably municipalities. I feel like
different city to city.
Oh, it is, eh?
I would imagine it's definitely different.
And I think coastlines are federal jurisdiction,
Yes.
below the tide line,
Yes.
something like that. But don't quote us on that.
No.
Please look into no, we are not legal experts.
I did a quick Google search to see you can get a license for aquatic plant harvesting, but it's a specific like license you have to get. Oh yes. So there's a lot of legalities.
Yes. Yeah, but good, excellent question. Yeah, it's just like harvesting in it on land. You want to make sure you're doing that where you're allowed to do that. So actually, thanks for pointing that out. Any other questions in there, Jenny?
Not at the moment.
Okay, well, we've got about 5 more minutes, so we want to keep looking for something. Oh, I know. I was going to ask you, Joel, you sent us some pictures before. Is there any pictures in there you might want Jenny to show of things we might see?
There's a bunch of different beaches, and one of the great things that Henry and I have started to look at lately is, you know, wrack is cool. You all know that now. We've been talking about this. You know wrack is cool. But now we're starting to say, wait, is every beach different? Is every rack different? And kind of come back, great question we had earlier about where is the rack coming from. And what we're starting to find is maybe different beaches are totally determined by what's offshore. So if you have a rack that this one is mostly alba, and it's funny, Henry and I are almost getting good enough now that we can tell the color when you drive up. Like, wait, this one's a bright green. This one's going to be all alba. And sometimes you see big knotty spaghetti noodles like this.
Is that is the alba is what the common name is? Sea lettuce, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is.
I think. Yeah, it's like very clear, and people put it on there.
Squishy.
Yeah,
like it like disintegrates right away.
Okay, so that's the alba. Right. Yeah, it is bright green.
And then, you know, or is it a lot of big knots of bull kelp, or is it a bunch of dried eelgrass? And now our next level question, because every time we're doing science, it's always about, okay, what's the next level question? The next one is, do different types of rack have different things? And then is that different insects that are here? And then are there different insects eating those insects? And then the other factor, the other dimension you can look at is time. You know, is there this type of rack this type of year? And then after a big winter storm in January, is it a different type of rack? So there's all these different ways. Once we even know the species, there's things we don't know. And you could talk to someone, and some of those pictures that are online are other beaches we've gone to where we're like, wow, this is a really strange combination of rack. Let's see what's here. Maybe people who live around here, live here for thousands of years, no, this is a weird beach because this is what washes up here. And we're like, wow, let's learn about what's here.
Yeah. It looks like Jenny's sharing. She might have okay. You want to come around and see what pictures she's showing? Maybe you can, that was just to show that's rack on the beach right there.
Yeah, and see, that's the side of thing we would see when we drive right up. And you're like, ooh, that's a lot of green. We're guessing it's alba. Let's go out there and see what's in the alba right now.
Got it.
It also helps to be there at the right tide, if it's high tide or low tide.
Right. Thanks for sharing that, Jenny.
For sure. We also had another question is, where does rack get its name?
Oh, I don't know the origin.
Henry,
of the word.
Do you know?
I don't know the etymology of the name rack, but I know rack is applied not only to the algae and grasses that we're talking about, but rack is also applied to things like these logs that you see
Oh, really?
here.
Driftwood
Oh,
counts
okay.
as rack?
Driftwood.
Oh, okay.
I
Okay,
didn't know
but you
My
know,
umbrella.
in our conversation, we're referring to algae and
Right.
eelgrass, wrack. But I know rack is a very broad term.
Okay.
So, but you know,
We're talking about the rack that has food. It's a food source.
but here because we're
Right.
biologists, we're interested in
Right.
the rack that has food
That's
and
a
other
lie.
animals on it. So that's what we're referring to.
So if you have some kind of like human-caused rack where you have large patches of garbage wash in, is that just considered to be like artificial rack or human-caused rack?
Well, we have a term for that. We call that anthropogenic debris, and that just literally means human produced, human caused, and we refer to it as debris more often than not for a couple of reasons. One is that we're also seeing this debris floating out in the water as well as on land, right? But the common thing about all of these, in different ways, they work in different ways. But the one common thing that ties all this together is that debris, is that rack as a whole, different kinds of rack, they provide different surfaces for organisms to live on. Now, if you have a large amount of floating debris, and that's another topic I know, but if you have a large amount of floating debris, if the debris is large enough, for example, with the debris that came with the 2011 Japanese tsunami, you can actually transport whole ecosystems, whole communities, okay, to different places, as we saw in that debris when you have Japanese nearshore communities, coastal communities being transported to North America. So the different kinds of rack, different kinds of debris, different kinds of effects. Okay, but here today, what we are talking very narrowly about algae and seagrass rack.
Right. And I saw somebody asked, is it seaweed? So yeah, the kind of rack we're talking about, this is a type of seaweed. This sea lettuce,
So
this one, and the fucus is a kind of, and the bull kelp is a kind of seaweed.
This is eelgrass.
And there's eelgrass.
That's right. We find a lot of the more, I don't know why, but sometimes a lot of terms like seaweed and so on are kind of mysterious to me, because what is a weed? Weed is something that you don't like, right? And I like these things, so I seldom use the word.
They're plants.
Seaweed.
They're aquatic plants.
Some of them are plants, vascular plants. Others are not.
Okay.
Like algae is algae, and these grasses are plants, right? So that's why I keep saying algae and plants.
Right.
In that sense, but you're right. You could use the term seaweed, but it's a little less
Right.
specific.
Correct. Right. It's like one of those classic
Well, there
common
you go.
terms that isn't entirely correct. Okay, well, thank you both. I think we're out of time, unless there's a pressing question, Jenny.
No, there's no more questions, but I don't want to be quoted on it, but I quickly tried to look up the origin of the word rack, and apparently it could be from the root to push or to cast ashore. So it's on the shore and it's pushed there, so maybe that's where it came from. But
Interesting.
I'm trying to think of other words that have that origin, but I can't think of any. Rack on tour. That's not the same thing.
Okay, I'm going to flip it around. The rain is just starting just now as we're ending. Oh, I see. Excellent presentation. People are saying, oh, there's some seaweed. You're eating it? Yeah, a lot of our coastal seaweed is edible, but again, don't quote us on that. Be with an expert. Thank you so much. Henry, you want to wave to everybody before we go? Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
This is recorded and it'll be on our YouTube channel pretty soon. Thanks again. Take care. We'll see you in November, I hope. Bye-bye.